Great. Well, this is today's very first office hour for Achieving the Dream Awards and Recognitions. I'm Meredith Hatch. I serve as Director of Network Relations. And I'll have a few of my colleagues introduce themselves and we'll get started. This is really, because it's an office hour, it's kind of free form and we want to hear the questions that you have and have a chance to respond to them. There'll be people joining throughout the hour, and you're also welcome to leave at any point, if you have a specific question that we respond to today. So I'll pass it over to my colleague, Lori Haycock.
Hi, I'm Laurie Haycock. I'm our ATD Senior Advisor for Data and Analytics. Thanks so much for joining. As Meredith said, we're just here to answer your questions and want this to be real informal and meaningful for you. So don't be shy with those questions. And I'll tap Devorah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Devorah Sharma, Executive Director of Research and Assessment. Looking forward to your questions today. And Elaine.
I'm Elaine Reese. I am Director of Data and Analytics. Again, looking forward to hearing your questions. Who else hasn't spoken? Rayleigh's here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rayleigh. I am the Administrative Coordinator for our Network Engagement Team. So I support our Network Engagement Team in our awards and designations. So please feel free to ask any question. We can help you as best as we can.
Well, with that, we'd love to hear your questions. So there are a couple ways to ask questions. You can certainly unmute yourself. And the other way is to put your questions in the chat. And so I'm going to pull up the chat right now. And okay, so Dean Kelly says, I know we have to show a 4-year trend of growth for the data section. How do you want us to account for COVID impacts to data? We have some good trends. Then with COVID, retention completion has gone down. Thoughts? And so I'll ask my colleagues Lori and Devorah to respond.
That is a great question, and one that I think many of our colleges will experience. So, I think you have a great opportunity in the narrative portion to address the impacts of COVID. And that's where you,
Yeah, I agree. If you've got trends that have been going up and then you saw dips because of COVID, make sure you address that in the narrative. Part of what we're looking for is how well you can connect what's happening on campus and the changes you've made on campus to the data. There's also a place for you to just put a note in the data template, I believe, if something is not quite to eligible trend. Please use that. You don't have to put a lot in there, but you can just say more information in the narrative that directs our folks who are reviewing your data template to look to your narrative to get further context on your data.
Great point, Devorah. I do just want to reiterate using your narrative and also using their different sections throughout the application where you're able to back up and provide justification for different responses. And those would be excellent places to include information about different impacts on data, particularly given the environment we're in with COVID. Another question is from Christopher. So the data template has several demographic categories. We don't specifically track student parents. Do we have to include that group? The template does not allow us to replace the group. And so Elaine, can you respond to this question?
Sure, and I'm going to follow up to the last question as well and say that I would recommend that if you have kind of some interesting data trends that you want to make note of, definitely write in detail on the narrative. You have lots of space there. But the very last tab of the data template, even though it says it's for ATD use, because we use to kind of review everything in one place. There's a notes box with like each line of each breakout, and that might be a good place to just put, you know, maybe even as a reminder, as a flag that you wrote about it in detail in your larger application. Because therefore, if I'm looking at the data template myself, I'll know immediately to go to what's more detailed in the application instead of leaving a giant sentence in a tiny box. So just a side note to that. Regarding the demographic categories, no, if you are not tracking that metric at all, we understand that that's not always been a typical metric. We put it on there for multiple reasons. One, there are some colleges that are tracking this metric, and we want to give every opportunity to show that maybe somebody's made improvement in this area. But it's also an indication for us to see, or it's an indication to you to think about, maybe I should be thinking about tracking this in the future. So it's more of an encouragement to say, even if I'm not doing this right now, maybe we should consider this. You don't have to worry about replacing it. We're not going to look at it and say you have an incomplete data template just because you didn't fill in this area. It's not like leaving out, say, gender that you probably should and are tracking. And if you have a different group of interest that's not already listed, I would encourage you to use the create your own group of dichotomous nature that you'll find instructions how to fill that in on the first page. So don't worry about, you know, finding a replacement group if you don't have one.
Thank you. Other questions that you have, you can certainly unmute or put them in chat for folks who have just joined. This is really an informal office hours, and we're really happy to respond to any questions that you have today. We also know that you may have questions afterwards. We have an additional office hour later in August. And also at any point, you're welcome to email network@achievingthedream.org with your questions. And so I do want to also highlight Achieving the Dream has recently uploaded today some videos that may be helpful to you as you're completing your applications. So I'm going to quickly share my screen. And so if you go to the application page for any of Achieving the Dreams awards or designations, so this one, for example, is Leader College of Distinction. So you see that you can download the application form, the rubric, the data template, and then there's a place where you can click to submit the application materials. We also have uploaded some videos about the materials. So, you know, using the rubric, how to use the data template, connecting efforts with reform outcomes, and tips on downloading and filling out the PDF form, which is one of the main parts of the application. So I wanted to make sure that you're aware of these materials. So I'll stop the share now. See if there are any other questions that folks have. So I thought it may be useful, would it be useful for folks to walk through some of the application elements? Are there specific questions that you have? Okay. Kristen, this actually is a whole group question. So we want to make sure to be able to send you the information that you need. So certainly if, for example, you were forwarded this email, but you really wish you were getting the emails about ATDs, awards and recognitions and other information, email us at network@achievingthedream.org. You can also talk to your coaches to make sure that you are receiving the appropriate information from Achieving the Dream, so you can get these directly. And Kristen, I'm noting your name so that we can follow up with you. So Michael, great question. Some of you have seen that Achieving the Dream for the first time has added finalist award interviews or finalist interviews for the Leah Meyer Austin Award specifically. And so that's a new element to the application review, and we'll be reaching out in November to finalists for the Leah Meyer Austin Award to invite interviews to talk a bit more about your college's successes and to dig in as well. I wonder if any of my colleagues would like to add there. So again, that's a new component of the Leah Meyer Austin Award, specifically reaching out to finalists for interviews in November. Okay, another question. Let's see. Can you review the must-haves in the application? So I think this may be a good spot for my colleague Devorah to talk a little bit about the rubrics.
Sure. So as you're going through the application, all of the questions are required. But when you're trying to really figure out what makes a strong application, each of the awards has a copy of the rubrics that we're going to be using to review those applications. And so if you look at the rubrics and especially focus on the top two boxes for each one, which is the exemplary response, which is usually a 4, and then what we would award 3 points to, which is a really strong response. That'll help you ensure that you have included all the elements that we'll be looking for. And, in the short term, we really are looking for applications to connect the work that you're doing to the data outcomes. So obviously we want to celebrate improvements in student outcomes, but we also want to know what changes you made that you believe contributed to those outcomes. Does that answer the question? Michelle, feel free to unmute if you want me to tell you more.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Devorah. So Lindsay, you asked a question about what is required. Can you say a little bit more about that? Maybe I'll start with my response. So Achieving the Dream has specific eligibility requirements, and because your college was invited to apply for Leader College recertification, Leader College of Distinction, Leader College of Distinction recertification, or the Leah Meyer Austin Award, you have met those eligibility requirements. We'll also look to make sure that your college is current in its Achieving the Dream participation. And so all colleges that were invited to participate are current in their participation right now. And also in good standing with your accrediting agency. So not on warning and not on probation. Lindsay, does that answer your question? Lindsay's certainly happy to follow. Oh,
I'm Lindsay's colleague, so I may jump in because this
okay.
is a question we both had. Our question is really also, are we required to sort of take on a coaching contract as part of there's some ambiguity on your website, which that's part of what we're wondering.
Sure, you are not required to take on a coaching contract to have a specific, to be eligible or to receive a specific award or designation.
Right, you just have to be active in the ATD network.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is related to specific metrics and definitions of metrics. So the question is, does the credits attempted metric have a time frame associated with it? For example, should we look at credits attempted earned within the first semester or the first year, or is that up to the institution?
Yeah, that should be the year. I could have sworn that the time frame was on there somewhere, but it's possible that in some updates like that part got lost. But that is a first. Most everything other than complete. I mean, completion obviously is. I mean, 6-year completion is 6-year completion. That's a given. All of the other metrics are. They're 1-year time spans, and fall to fall retention is obviously fall to the subsequent fall. So no, there's nothing that's shorter than a year.
Thank you.
That's right. It's an early momentum metric, credits, that credit completion ratio in the first year.
Great. So the first year specifically is the answer. Okay. And there are no silly questions. Looking at the next one. Okay. So, when looking at specific student populations, we are finding a significant growth in performance of a population of students, veterans, that we do significant work with. That's great. However, looking at the data over the past few years, it seems as though this population has actually been outperforming their peers in these metric areas. Is this a usable population to explore, or should we be specifically looking at narrowing a gap within the past 3 to 4 years from a student population that showed an initial disparity in performance between the noted group and their non-group peers? Is that gap narrowing? Garrett, you are making sense, and I'm going to ask my colleagues to talk a little bit more about equity gap narrowing. So I'm going to pass it over to Lori and to Elaine.
So I think there might be instances where you have a Pell population or a veteran population that's outperforming their comparison group. And in those cases, you can still highlight that data and show that the gap has closed, and just provide, again, the narrative context for that and connect with it, what you've done to have those outstanding outcomes for those target populations. So we don't want to penalize you if you've closed a gap and say that you, right, but just, again, give us more context in your narrative for how you've served the Pell population, the veteran population, et cetera, so that we have a holistic view of how you've connected the reforms you're doing to the improvement in those outcomes.
Thank you, Lori. Any follow-up, Elaine?
I was just going to say that we get this way more than you may think. So it's definitely not a silly question. I would say that situations where it's kind of obvious that there was an overtake and pass of metrics, meaning like, let's say you had veteran students and non-veteran students, let's say initially the veteran students were slightly underperforming and they just increased at leaps and bounds and are now performing way better than the non-veteran students. We're not going to instantly look at that and say, well, the non-veteran students should also have been moving up at the same rate. That's where it really comes down to your narrative when the data are not necessarily so cut and dry, because you will have the rest of the story behind that data, which will help make a compelling case. If we just look at the numbers alone, we don't know what went on there to cause that, which is why those notes are important. I would also say, hopefully if in this example, if you're looking at veteran students, you have a reasonable sized population. Like, for example, if you have 20 veteran students and you have 2,000 non-veteran students, we're not necessarily going to look at that too seriously and say, wow, they made great work. Not that those 20 students don't matter, because they certainly do, but to look at percentage changes with such a volatile difference in n sizes, that's what makes a difference. So, again, just do a little bit of a gut check to say, like, is this a reasonable number, or is this like bordering on, not that we're looking at programs, but I always call it the boutique program issue of, we made great changes, like, for this very, very, very small group of students that you're trying to compare to the whole. So these are the things that I think about when I look at the data.
I think the other thing to note, I know we have a comment that it can't be at the expense of another population. And what we mean by that is if your non-veteran students were declining in performance, and that's why the veteran students are now looking like they're outperforming, that obviously is not as successful of an outcome as we'd like to see. However, if the non-veteran students were staying steady or improving at a slower rate than your veteran students, especially because you guys have been specifically targeting some work to support your veteran students better, then absolutely you have the ability to make the case that this is some gap narrowing.
Thank you. I'm going to move to the next question, and we can always go back to talking about equity gaps, because that's really critical to these applications. I'm going to ask my colleague Lori to respond to Shelley's question. Is it okay to submit 3-year completion data? I know the completion metric mentioned 4-year data, but we may not have full data available for calculating 4-year rates.
Yes, Shelley, if you don't have the sufficient trend for 4-year graduation rates, you can use the 3-year graduation rate. Just be sure to label that and to make sure you describe that in the narrative, so you flag that for us. That's sufficient.
Other questions that folks have?
And some of this is in the isn't covered in the little video vignettes that we did, but it is really helpful for us when you're writing your application and you're writing your narrative to strongly connect the dots for us, right? When you're talking about the reforms you're undertaking, connect that to the metrics that you're reporting on. So for instance, if you choose Gateway Math completion in the first year, successful Gateway Math completion in year 1 as one of the early momentum metrics that you are showing progress on, connect that to your use of multiple measures of assessment, co-requisites, math pathways aligned with student end goals, things like that, so that we know how your strategies are connecting to that metric. So the more you can be intentional on that, it really helps us as the reviewers.
Another question is, can we include summer starters if they were enrolled for the immediate fall semester? So can we include summer starters if they were enrolled for the immediate fall semester? And we have gotten in the past a lot of questions about starting with summer or ending with summer term. And so the key there, and I know my colleagues will want to follow up on this, is be consistent. Whatever you choose to do, if you start with summer, then for every subsequent year, start with summer. If you end with summer, then for every subsequent year, please end with summer. My colleagues may have some important clarifications to that, but that's what I keep in mind.
Yeah, I'm pretty certain that in this year's application, in the data sheet, because I remember writing this, in the definition section, there is a note that says on the like probably one of the first rows, there's a note to say if you want to define your year as, we typically say fall, spring, summer, but if there's a reason why you want to make it summer, fall, spring instead, we're okay with that. So that's why in this case, like where even the cohort at the top says, fall of 2018, you can really have that mean summer of 2018. But again, just make a note that that's what you did. Just so even if we go back to do something later and we say, why isn't this data lining up? We know it's because you started with summer because you wanted to capture those early starters.
Thanks, Elaine. And then another specific definition and cohort question. Are we counting, or a definition question, are we counting the courses that students took from other colleges within the same district? We might need a little bit more information there.
Like, is there kind of open transfer between, meaning is it common that students will bounce around a lot and say, okay, I decided this term to take a course at essentially another campus? Right, if that's the case, because again, that's something that's germane to your particular institution, that's not the same as say, I'm at an institution that is nowhere near anything else, and we're just looking at credits that are transferred in from a completely unrelated college whatsoever. That's a different situation. I personally would count those colleges because again, to me, it almost just, it's your college's way of just defining, it's like being on another campus. It's still in the same family. I would count them. I'll let somebody else jump in if they disagree, but that's what I would count them.
Yeah, I agree. If those courses are being used by the students to move towards whatever degree or certificate programs they're in, it makes sense to count them.
So we have another question about equity gaps. And this is a clarification about equity gaps. And this is a follow-up to something that Devorah was talking about, the expense of another student population. Okay, so there is an overall increase for a significant minority population, specifically students with Pell PEPs who receive Pell on the fall-to-fall persistence metric, accompanied by a reduction of the equity gap. The gap was reduced by 6 percentage points. 3 of those points were due to an increase in our Pell students. The other 3% were unfortunately a decrease in non-Pell persistence. Can we still use this as a qualifying reduction? And that is a hard word problem.
It's like one of those math word problems. The train is coming at you.
Yeah, so I think
we're looking for 2 percentage points overall.
Right. So if we're following this, right, then essentially, even if we don't take into account the decrease in the non-Pell, you still had a 3% increase with your Pell students, and that does narrow the gap. So I think, again, just really clarifying in your narrative that you understand that there's still work to be done with your non-Pell students. Elaine, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I kind of read this as the gain. I look at this as the gap was closed still at the expense of non-Pell students, if I'm reading this correctly. But then again, if it was that one went, the gap is reduced by 6 points. So it was
the gap's
reduced,
been narrowed but not closed. I
yeah,
think if I'm reading the word problem.
They were neck and neck. Pell went up in its performance by 3. Non-Pell went down in its performance by 3, which means that the difference is now, yeah, but that's an increase. Something's not, I'm missing something here. If you look, I guess the follow-up is, if we just look at a line of Pell, what's the trend? Non-Pell, what's the trend? From the beginning point to the end point, did non-Pell end up at a higher place than they were 4 years ago, or are they lower than they were 4 years ago? Because if the answer was 3 years ago, if non-Pell students are lower than their starting point, then that's fairly clear that the gap reduction happened at the expense of non-Pell. If it was just a matter that non-Pell went up or was flat and Pell students went up, then that's more of the gap closing. I know this is confusing.
Basically, we're looking for the equity gap to narrow by 2 percentage points and not at the expense of another population. So if you can explain that in the narrative, you're good.
Yeah, if it didn't happen at the expense of somebody, then that's fine. If it technically happened at the expense of somebody, then that would take some more explaining.
Yeah. And I would say, don't be shy about referencing specifics in your data in your narrative. So, obviously this word problem's clearly a good test for all of us. It would be a lot easier for us if we had your data template in front of us, but in your narrative, being able to reference the exact data points that you're talking about will help all of us to follow your narrative, and it'll make it stronger, quite frankly, when we read it.
Thank you. And again, this is not your last time to ask questions. You can always email network@achievingthedream.org. If you have questions, we can really dig into the specifics.
Yeah, even if you want to email and say, like, here's the numbers for this section, how would you evaluate this? Then, like, we'll let you know just what it looks like on the surface numerically, and then say, like, but if you have an explanation for XYZ, then feel free to throw that in.
Thank you. So Kristen asked, this might be on the data template somewhere. And Kristen, I'm really glad you're asking this question, because this is a change from last year. Is it all right to include dual enrolled high school students and or unmatriculated students, or should we remove them and include only matriculated students? I'm going to have Elaine respond to this question.
Sure. So the key is currently dual enrolled high school students. That's the crux of the question right there. We've made a change from prior years that there's now two options for definition of first time ever in college. One is first time ever in college coming in with exactly 0 credits. We call this the purest of pure cohorts, that everybody is starting from 0 the second they set foot on your campus. So it means they came in with dual enrollment, they wouldn't be counted. We understand that's not realistic many times and is kind of a detriment, but you don't necessarily want to go as far as saying just any student new to our campus, which could include somebody who just transferred from another college, which would be the all student cohort. So we made an in-between cohort. First time ever in college, but has prior college credit from secondary enrollment. So formally dual enrolled, advanced placement, international baccalaureate, for example. In your case that you're naming is currently dual enrolled high school students. So these are students who have not yet graduated high school, but are on your campus. I would not include those students. This is different than students who may be coming in with credit from dual enrollment. They would fit into that new middle definition, but students who are currently dual enrolled don't include. Unmatriculated students, as I understand the definition, I would also not include, meaning if they're not actually, I mean, to me, that means they're not really enrolled. At the starting point, I wouldn't include those students either. But on the dual enroll, yeah, if they're just current dual enrollment students, don't include them. Glad that helped.
Other questions? You've asked a broad array of questions so far. Thank you. Keep them coming if you have more. Again, this is not your only chance to ask questions, but it is a good forum for it. This recording will be available as well. Just going to pause, give folks a chance to gather their thoughts. You can unmute, you can type into the chat. I'm going to give my colleagues a chance to say, if they were thinking somebody would ask a question and they didn't. Are there any questions you want to answer in advance? We do have another question. Another definition question related to completion. Can we count degrees, certifications that our students earn from our sister colleges within the same district? We may need to do some individual follow-up.
Yeah, I think we run into like, are the colleges in the district independently accredited? Are they also applying for awards? Like there's some nuances there, so we should probably have a sidebar conversation on what's most appropriate in your instance.
Yeah, I think it's a little different of the actual degrees earned versus just saying I took a class. Because like taking a class there's probably a lot of back and forth during the student's collegiate career to say who finally gets the credit for that certification. That's definitely a sidebar. I will say though, again, in any of this, we're not comparing your data sheet to anybody else's data sheet. You're being compared to yourself and the growth that you're making. So that's why, as we keep saying, just be really consistent. But it's not that we're looking at sheets side by side and saying, well, college A, was running graduation rates in the 70s and college B was running graduation rates in the 30s. And therefore we're definitely going to go with college A. Even though we happen to just maybe look sometimes it like just for a general bird's eye of like how our college is doing, that's not that's not really how we look at it. We look at things individually in terms of, especially for Leader College.
And then how also we try to be consistent with how the graduation rates would be measured, like by the National Student Clearinghouse or in the Post-Secondary Data Partnership. So that's another good just way for you to think about that.
All right, everyone. We're going to have last words for today's session. If you have more questions or if my colleagues have any closing remarks they'd like to make. All right, everyone. With that, this will be recorded. You will be able to find it on the Achieving the Dream Network or the Achieving the Dream website, probably next week. We're having another office hour in later in August. You're welcome to sign up for that or to email us at network@achievingthedream.org, and we'll be sure to respond to your question either via email or a phone call. And we're just really grateful for your participation in the Achieving the Dream Network, your commitment to student success, and to joining our office hours today. So thank you, everyone.